155. Sorry, 150. My ebook is on 154. And there's a list.
Okay, yeah.
Well,
Yeah, before. Okay.
no, go ahead, Tasha. Go ahead.
Okay, it just says before examining particular cases, it would be well to summarize the analytical perspective developed in previous chapters. This will be done by presenting a checklist of questions one should ask when evaluating a case study of economic statecraft. So it poses 9 questions that we need to think about
Yeah,
for each case
I
study.
didn't see that. Yeah, I know I've got the book right here. Thank you.
Yeah.
yeah, he does a great job of basically saying, okay, so I spent 150 pages developing an analytical framework, and here it is in one paragraph. Like, here's the checklist that you do based on everything that I just established. And then what's cool is he does it for like an entire massive chapter. It's massive, but he goes through like all of these examples and he says, well, this is the conventional wisdom. And actually, I mean, I think assigning Baldwin, I mean, I wish that I could assign that book earlier in most people's exposure to the NSS, because it's like, it's a handbook. Like it's a version of IR writing that was really common when he wrote. Like, you read other people like him at that same time, like in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and it's like, this is technical writing. This is not, it's not literary. It doesn't attempt to be. It's a checklist, right? Like, here's my theory, here's the checklist, here I'm going to apply it, right? And then also, he's very rudimentary in the way and I don't mean that in a bad way, in the way he goes about fact checking and engaging with the literature, right? Like, he's like, this is a conventional wisdom, and it's a conventional wisdom because here's the 15 main textbooks that we use to teach IR in the United States. Here is each section from each textbook that talks about this. Look, there's the theme. It is the right. So I thought it's just very, I mean, I could never probably write like him, but I want to be able to write like him. Like, I want to have that level of clarity when I convey things. And how, the reason why I say I wish I could assign it is because, like, when I say things like, well, you have to situate your own interpretation in the literature, like, he does it in like a very like direct, some would say boring, dry way, but like, you at least see
Yeah.
how it works, right? Like, you're never not sure, well, is that really what people think, or like, no, like, here's the 15 thing. So it's great. So what I wanted to do today, with the two of you, and so you both have, so Zartasha has the checklist. I had a
Yes.
meeting run very, very, very late, so I'm behind the ball. I don't have my copy of Baldwin with me, so I'm going to rely on you to help me when we get there. What I
Okay.
want to do is I want to take a section from the current national security strategy. So this was published in October, to much fanfare. I say that tongue in cheek. Defense nerds were very excited. The blogosphere that talks about foreign relations was very excited. IR profs at Midwestern colleges that wear wool jackets were very excited. That was the fanfare. But it does stipulate some interesting things, and what I want to do is take the section where it talks about trade and economics, which it amounts to 3 paragraphs on page 34 and 35. Now, we're going to heavily caveat this, where the sort of larger discussion of geoeconomic competition takes the entire 35-page document, but we're going to excise this and use it. I put the link to it in the chat so that you can go to it. I'm going to give you a few minutes to read it. And I want us to subject it to Baldwin's checklist, right? And I want us to talk about whether or not it accomplishes the things that that Baldwin sets out, and if it doesn't, exercising our own acumen as analysts to try to fill that in, right? What should this look like, right? What would gradients of success look like, and so on and so forth. So does that make sense? So the first thing I wanted to do is give you just a few minutes, and if you're watching the recording, Claudia, you can do this now. Go to the NSS, and I want you to read those 3 paragraphs on page 34, okay? So I'm going to give Zartasha, you and Marcy a moment to do that. I'm going to mute myself as I deal with my dog.
I'm getting there right now. And I have the Baldwin book in front of me. If we need a reference for it, I pulled up the page, the checklist.
So just give it a few minutes.
Somehow it must have backpedaled to the earlier chat. The link that you provided went away. And I was already looking at it.
Just throw it in
Can-
there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm Marcy.
bad,
I threw a fresh link in the chat.
Oh, good. Thank you. It's like it went away and then it came back without the link. I think we have a touchy Zoom thing here.
It's probably when I hit record.
No, Zoom was acting up earlier today and yesterday and Monday, actually. So maybe not pilot error.
Just let me know when you've had a chance to read it quickly.
I've read over it.
Great. So
It-
Zartasha, are you good?
Yep.
All right. Somebody help me with the first one on his little checklist there. Just the
Okay.
italicized part, the wording of the actual.
Right. Has
Oh.
the policy contingency framework
Been carefully established at the beginning.
All right. And what Baldwin is getting at here, right, is the idea that your policy has a particular desired outcome. It's responding to a very specific kind of thing. Have you stipulated that at the outset, right? Or did you start doing things about things you didn't like and things got messy? Okay. What I think would be helpful is to bifurcate these, right? So what evidence do we have of a policy contingency framework in the NSS? and then how would we critique or expand upon it? So that's what I'm going to use the two columns for. So I'll throw to both of you, right? We'll start with you. I mean, is it clear to us that there's a policy contingency framework here that's been set out and illustrated?
I don't think so.
Why not?
It's in this few paragraphs that covers what we're talking about is generalities. And, we're working to do this. We're, going to tackle that. I don't see clarity. Now, I have to say my computer bounced in and out while I was reading it, but it's okay, and that needs to be larger. Longstanding rules govern.
Well, no, I was just going to bring reference to one part, right? So not to say that you're wrong, but I mean, because this is there is a offhanded mention of China, right? Like it seems really weird. Like there is this offhanded sort of mention of China, right? Which doesn't seem very clear according to Baldwin's argument, right? Like, what are you trying to influence, right? Is it China? Is it not China? Is that clear here? Go ahead, Mark.
There's also the type of crap that you see in government documents that the United States has been benefited from international, blah, 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 for a long time. There's just a lot of meaningless rhetoric through these kinds of documents. And I see that as slanting the ambiguity. And then, let's see, recent work with the PCF, this is moving around and it's small, and the American Prosperity for Economic Prosperity, for the Economic Prosperity Show. Okay, I'm getting PTSD from working in the government when I read this.
Well, I mean, I would just say before I ask Natasha, I mean, we have to be careful, right? Because one of the things that I thought was really essential about the Baldwin readings from last week, right, was where he takes on that idea that like neoliberal sort of free market understandings of global economics are not geoeconomic in nature, right? They are, right? And he's very clear about that. He's like, yes, they are geoeconomic in nature. They actually argue that free trade and sort of like worker-focused policies do create an environment that's pursuant to the national interest, right? Because they dissuade violence and they circumscribe other actors' ability to maneuver, right? I think that's really important when it starts talking, because what it is that they say they're going to do is they're going to force focus on rules, standards, and expectations, right, in order to do that. So I think there's, at least to be devil's advocate, some sense of a geostrategy here. Like if we create an economic world that's conducive to good workforces, we will constrain the actions of other geoeconomic actors. You have to read through the lines here, but I think you could make that point. Zartasha, what do you think?
It's poses a very if-then kind of argument, this trade and economic policy. If we do this, then this will happen. If we take care of our, global debt challenges, then the PRC will fall in line. So there's a very if-then kind of formatting to it. Baldwin talks about statesmen may sometimes undertake an influence attempt with only one goal and one target in mind, but this is surely the exception rather than the rule. So right here, we're kind of seeing the Biden administration, just with this trade and economic, these three paragraphs, kind of point towards Chinese economy and Chinese government, but it doesn't really seem like they're outlining any definite goal. Like, is the goal of our economy getting stronger to make China's economy weaker? Or is there some other underlying attempt to influence? So this doesn't seem very policy based. It's very vague.
Which Marcy, I think, was getting at, right? Like, I think that's true here. Like,
yeah.
I think it's quite clear that and I say this a little bit in the lecture, and I tried to hit the tone of, I don't think you can look at this and say there is no policy contingency continuum, right? Like, I don't think that criticism is fair. I think there is in here enough that says, yeah, what we see is the attempt to create a particular kind of economic environment. The implication is it will constrain the ability of other actors to do nefarious geoeconomic things, right? So the criticism that there isn't a strategy here, I don't think is very apt. But I think both of you are correct in the sense that, yeah, but like, what does all of this amount to, right? Like, what is, like, what are you going to do to create what particular outcome is really muddy. And it starts to read, I think, Marcy's work about like remark about rhetoric, right? Like, the other thing is I would look at this, and even then, I think you're being a little generous on the if then, because like, I don't see a lot in here that's like, we do X and Y happens, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't see a lot of that. I don't see a lot of, and Baldwin's very, very clear that you need to be careful about how you construe that as an analyst, but as a strategy document, right? That's supposed to set out a strategy. Yeah, like, what are you gonna do? Like here's an example. We will tackle the harms caused to US workers, consumers, and businesses by currency manipulation. Okay. Counter corruption and illicit finance, and end the race to the bottom for corporate taxation through promotion of the OECD's global minimum tax. Okay. There's one means here, right? This, just specifically designed to make countries like Ireland levy the same corporate taxes as everybody else so that big tech companies don't offshore their wealth, right? Okay, which is great. But how is that going to help you with currency manipulation? Like, I don't
Right.
see
So there's
that.
a lot of if statements, but not a lot of then statements.
Yeah.
If we do this, if we do this, if we do this, but there's not a lot of then this will happen.
All right. So
Okay.
what
I'll
do you
rephrase
think?
that.
So if you were to offer a different policy contingency framework for this section of the document, what do you think you would offer?
Okay. I think if we were talking about, from if this was like me writing this, right?
Yeah.
I think of, what are the problems and then what are the solutions? And that's really, I don't know, dumbing it down or making it too simplified. Because this just seems like a bunch of word vomit. Like they're just saying words to say words. And the goals are nice, but there's no tangible strategy accredited to the goals, which is what's making this difficult to follow. So I would add tangible goals towards the very end saying, okay, well, we are going to do all of these things, which they're saying, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, X, Y, Z. And then we need solutions to X, Y, Z. Well, what are we going to do to get closer to the solutions? Which is why I agree with Marcy that it sounds more like rhetoric than it does, a strategy. It's not strategic in focus.
Okay. Marcy?
Did we lose Marcy?
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, we'll give it a second. Maybe it was just a computer. I mean, yeah,
Okay.
where that's clear for me is even in that one-off reference to China, right?
Right.
Where it's like non-market actors like the People's Republic,
Like the PRC.
it's
Yeah.
like, oh, yeah, like, okay, but like, there are lots of non-market actors, and they're not all the same. So like, what exactly? So do we need to have a conversation? So yeah, the policy contingency thing is murky, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there's at least some evidence of some of the things that Baldwin talks about, like conflating domestic economic considerations with national security ones. Like, I think it's very clear here, like, there is no discussion of trade-offs. Like, there isn't any talk here about like, we're going to do this to the American the American domestic economy to accomplish like X to the American domestic economy to produce Y outcome globally, and that will produce this externality in the United States that is worth it because of X or Y, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's no sorts of discussion of that.
Yeah.
What's his next one? Oh, sorry, Marcy, go ahead. We asked you, we didn't hear from you. We thought maybe you'd have
I was busy trying to talk and Zoom went crazy. I can't even describe what happened. I could hear you all.
Okay.
I could not find any links. So yes, I listened and I agree with Zartasha that as I said, it's rhetoric, it's just garbage. It's not specific. It speaks in generality terms that are designed to think, oh, they're going to look at that. Well, what about that are they going to look at? What do they plan to do? And as Tasha pointed out, where is the if that creates the then? And it's, I just think it reads like a government document. And I know that I have a contaminated opinion about that. So
What's the next one on Baldwin's checklist?
It's is the level of difficulty taken into account? But the level of difficulty of what? The plan?
Well, getting the effect of what you want, right? So, like, here's where things start to cascade a little bit, right? So, like, I think that Marcy's criticism is largely held, right? I don't think I'd go so far as saying it's complete rhetoric, right? Like, and I think that becomes clear when you set the NSSs against each other. Like, Obama's and Trump's and Biden's all look slightly different, right? And they do stipulate, and especially for the Obama administration, it did mark changes in policy, right? Now that's just to say that they do vary, so they're not just sort of vacuous. But I think you're right in the sense, like, but it is supposed to be a lodestone, right? Like, the NSS is supposed to stipulate the priorities of an administration to other government stakeholders, including the citizenry, but also Congress, and allies and adversaries, right? It's supposed to signal this is how we look at the world. And then other documents are supposed to follow in line behind it, right? Specifically like the NDF. So we have a national security strategy. We also have a national defense strategy. The national defense strategy is supposed to follow from the priorities outlined in the national security strategy. But if you've been following Washington lately, you'll know that we published the NDS before we published the NF. Backwards. We also drafted our budget before we had either. So that massive defense budget that we authorized at the end of last year was put together without any strategic guidance from an NDS, right? Which is supposed to stipulate the ends, ways, and means to address military, which would then influence what you buy, what you fund, right? It's all sort of gobbledygook. So don't get me wrong as trying to defend these documents is somehow sacred and very helpful. But I mean,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, Marcy, go ahead.
And looking back at what you were saying about when we were getting to number 2, and I agree with you completely. I don't think the NSS does what we would expect it to when we read it. And I'm sure they jumped to funding defense before they decided for what reason. But it looks like Baldwin's checklist is designed to be something you would follow with a specific thing. So if we were looking at only what they were going to do about whatever it says earlier in there about the dollar bill or something, whatever, there's whatever it mentions in there should be a point of a specific topic that the checklist would inform.
Yeah, he's talking about how you understand geoeconomic activity, right? So, like, when a state sets out a strategy to do something, has it specified a policy contingency framework, right? Now, a strategic document is going to think about these in collections, but I think what we ascertained is what we would likely expect in a passage like this, in a document like this, is not one policy contingency framework, but several, right?
Right.
And we don't have that.
Each of
have
which
a looser
would have,
association of themes.
yeah, but each of which would talk about is the difficulty taken into account?
Yeah.
Is it clear, blah, blah, blah. And we don't have any of that.
Yeah. And So one example would be like, how hard would it be to actually get China to obey by the rules that govern trade and other means of economic exchange, right? Now, the difficult, like, and Baldwin says this, right? In the chapter that follows this, he says this happens all the time. The level of difficulty is not ascertained because the goal is not clearly articulated, right? Like
Mhm.
these things can be connected. So, I mean, but what are you going to try? Because the PRC does follow some rules and it does engage in some institution. So, what is it about their behavior you're trying to alter, right? So the answer is like it's very vague, right? Like it's vague.
Yeah, alter it to make somebody else happy, or um, it. I remember we had discussions about the vagueness about Trump's, I guess it was national security policy during his regime, his presidency,
Yeah,
and same thing. It could be anything.
yeah.
So
Well, I mean, because these documents are a creature of the vagueness genre. What I'm trying to illustrate, I mean, just to be a little meta, is like, yeah, but you can still nonetheless critique them in more technical ways, right? So I think we've sort of gotten at a little bit of that, right? Like we could look for ends meets. To Zarzash's point, I mean, let's talk about China, right? Let's stipulate that. Let's there's a policy contingency continuum there, right? And what I was trying to get at was the idea that that can sit inside some of these points. Like some of these points are strategic, right? The idea that a particular free market system is constraining to states like China, right? Like if you can make the system function effectively, you can constrain them. When you watch the lecture for this week, I talk a little bit about this, right? Having an institutional system and having a market that states can actually engage in actually constrains geoeconomic potentials, right? Especially when it comes to debt diplomacy, because states have alternatives and they can undercut and the power becomes less fungible. So I think this is where we're sort of getting at the idea that the NSS is woefully unspecified. Also, there's no discussion of how hard this is. Like this, some of this stuff is hard. Like, really? Like your goal is to get the OECD to accept a global minimum tax? That's hard.
Yeah.
That's not easy. That
it's
means
also
like
it
going
is.
to tax haven countries like Ireland and telling them you're not going to do this anymore, and they make huge amounts of money off of it, right? That's hard.
Is
But
the acknowledgement of non-compliance, is it not equatable to the difficulty, I guess? Am I wording that correctly?
No,
So in
that's a good
yeah,
point. Baldwin says that later in his list, right?
okay.
Realize that you might not be able to coerce states to do the thing you want, but their non-compliance will have costs, and that in and of itself can be strategically beneficial.
Okay.
Right? Like he's very careful there, right? He's like realize so like I think if he was alive today, right? I don't think he's alive. Usually when someone else edits the second edition of your book, you're not.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know. I shouldn't joke, but I mean, I think he'd say like, yeah, you're not going to get Ireland to accept OECD minute, but you might be able to incur particular costs on Ireland for not following that, which may in and of itself create geoeconomic pressures that have nothing to do with Ireland. Right.
Right. The thing that I've picked up from the book so far is that non-compliance or non-participation isn't necessarily bad, because it can put
Yeah.
the sender state in a position of appointing a direct antagonist, which could be good for
Yeah.
the hegemon.
Yeah.
So it's not always bad that we don't have people that don't comply or don't conform to the liberal international system.
Yeah, that's right. I
Yeah.
think that's a good point here, right? In talking about how, so is there it like, so these do seem lofty, right? And maybe we can't force states to comply with them, but is there a reasonable sense in which non-compliance with our attempts to do this may also benefit us?
Yeah. And
Like,
it non-compliance and non-compliance specifically establishes the norms, because then it's non-compliant. It's labeled as such. so we know what the appropriate measures and the inappropriate, even if we can't enforce them, it kind of sets a bottom floor.
Okay. So it creates an environment of contestation, right?
Yes.
Which, thinking back to 500, this is where norms are developed, right?
Yes.
You have to make arguments, logics of appropriateness start to bite, right?
Yeah.
States start having to they have to start rationalizing their behavior. When they do that, we start thickening up expectations.
Yeah, I'm a constructivist at heart, so I really
Are
like
you?
that
Good.
argument.
I poisoned your mind. You're not a structuralist anymore. I think you were a
No.
structuralist back
I
in
was like, things have to be the
Thanks.
way that they have to be for a reason, and I don't feel that way anymore. So
Yeah, but I mean, but this is why, like, I'm having a lot of fun teaching this class, because I keep seeing the seeds that I've planted in other classes, right? Where it's like,
Browning.
last week I got to talk about a security community, right? Like, that really vague concept that we took from constructivism in 500. Like, no, this is literally happening. Like, you can see it happening, right?
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think, like, non-compliance, but you also have to get a bunch of states to explain why they're not complying, right? And ironically, you might be able to create particular kinds of normative pressure that way,
Right.
Which is a benefit, right? That's good, especially if it's, if it again contributes to the maintenance of a kind of order where your power is more fungible than your adversaries,
Right.
right? Marcy, did you have any thoughts?
I'm still thinking about the specificity factor, because I was going down a mental rabbit trail listening and thinking of other things, but last week we were talking about the sanctions, and I think they could be boiled down or reviewed in regard to this checklist with a lot more clarity than what we're seeing with the national security document we were looking at, because it's basically one sort of thing. Even the sanctions have layers. And anyway, I was just thinking like that. But as far as China and an international the trade thing you were talking about.
Yeah.
The countries all play by their own rules. When you're looking at China, North Korea, Russia, it wouldn't matter what rule they ascribe to, they're going to play by their own. And then forcing Ireland and some other fairly innocent country to go along with that point you were just bringing up there makes no sense. I don't know. I just think.
I think it's in terms of what, right? So again, like, this section isn't in general, like, you can't, I don't know if we can subject the entire section as one three paragraph document, but I mean, there's a list of things in here that we can apply Bowen's checklist to, right? So
right.
we just were talking about the use of an OECD minimum tax. The reason why you would do that is you would create circumstances by which you would prevent large multinational corporations from offshoring wealth, right? Which is what they do. So most of the MNCs, especially the ones that are headquartered in the United States, they offshore large amounts of their wealth. Google, Apple, they keep huge amounts of money in banks in Ireland under licensed subsidiaries in order to avoid paying corporate taxes in the United States.
Right. And Enron was an example as well. So,
yeah, it's commonplace. Most MNCs do it, right? Mm-hmm. Ireland has turned it into a business, right? They do it on purpose. But what we were simply talking about is, like, that's difficult, that's hard. There are also lots of other things in here that would be applicable, right? So the IPEF framework is one. Let me just take another one. So, like, the landmark steel and aluminum agreement with the European Union is another one. So it's basically we're talking about as a basket of things, right? What are the qualities that they all have? And I think so far what we've illustrated in general applies to each of these things. The policy contingency sort of relationship is not clearly spelled out. The difficulty is not really talked about, right? And you can see that in the sense that all of these things look the same, right? It looks like getting the OECD to adopt a global minimum tax and doing something with steel and aluminum with the European Union are the same, and they're quite frankly not. Right? They're quite frankly not. Like the idea that you could create a steel and aluminum agreement with the European Union actually is probably quite simple. In general, it's just a free trade agreement. Sure, great. But again, is it good or bad? I don't know. What are we trying to influence? Right? Like, what is the policy contingency outcome? Are we trying to create a stronger EU alliance with us for reasons that have to do with Russia? Maybe it is. Good, right? Is it because we need to create domestic input? Great, right? But I think that we can do this, right? Natasha, what's the third one? So we've done the first two on the checklist, the difficulty. What's the third one?
The third one is the utility of economic statecraft discussed in terms of alternative policy options. Beware of it hurts us more than it hurts them.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't think we have that. We don't have the thing that Baldwin was necessarily worried about. He was worried about people who say we shouldn't sanction another country because it hurts our domestic income more than it hurts them. Right. And he's like, that usually is wrong because it doesn't situate, we want to prevent them from doing something. And if we did, I mean, again, I don't see much of that, right? Do you see any evidence of that?
There's like a human rights element to this. That's another policy incentive that the Biden administration has added that the Trump administration didn't have and the Obama administration kind of shied away from. So that's one big difference. But are we talking, what are we referring to as policy options? Just economic statecraft? Or are we, looking at foreign policy, domestic policy,
All right.
I don't want to be incorrect in saying that, because Biden's trade and economics policy focuses a lot on human rights and labor repression or just labor inequality. Is that an alternative or is that an alternative policy option?
I mean, maybe, right? I mean, I think that's a way to frame it, right? Where you simply say, well, what are we trying to do? We're trying to create an environment that's conducive to free market economics and viable democracies, right? I think it's important to remember that that's big for Biden as well, right? Like he's made that really important. Sorry, I'm gonna try to share my screen again just so that we can get on the same page. So I think that's right. And yeah, are these economic means likely to fully do that? No. But like how else are you going to try to establish these norms? Like how else are you going to do, right?
How are you going to convince people to support you in your objectives?
And I think it's leveraging the idea that if, contestation from before, right? Like you force states to try to reconcile their behavior to their stated things, and you create an environment where their economic viability is contingent on that, right?
Yeah.
Which is at the end of the day, that's even how autocrats stay in power, right? They have to be able to support the right people. You'll create an environment that's more conducive. Now, these are very difficult. This is incredibly hard to do. It is unlikely that we'd be able to fully realize it. But I mean, that is a world that is more conducive to our interests. And is it easy? Would it be easier or even possible to make any progress any other way?
And note that right under the highlighted area, it says United States must once again rally, blah, blah, blah. A lot of this document, this would be an example, but I promise you it's in other areas, is framed in contrast what we were doing to before we were here. Trump, for example, once again, returning to something that we didn't have before we got here. And I think, to me anyway, that's clutter in a document that is designed or is intended to have some specific goals for the country that are very, very important. That's just my take on it.
Yeah, but I mean, and I think that's right. But I think one of the things that, but we as analysts don't have to accept that, right? Like we can say, we can critique the document, right? And we can say the way it construes things can be developed and further established. So the document itself is impoverished. We've established that.
Mhm.
I think what we're doing is talking about, well, if we were to strengthen it, what would that look like?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I
The
see what you're
reason
saying. Yeah.
the reason why I highlighted this section is, I mean, to your point, I mean, if you want to focus on one particular thing, we can focus on one particular. Let's get China to behave in a way that is consistent with a liberal economic order, because that's in our national security interest. Because it is. It's one of the few things that we actually have available to us geoeconomically. If we make it incredibly difficult for them to leverage the kinds of power that they can leverage, it's a world that's more conducive to our interests, right? There's a reason why China and Russia are averse to the idea of a system that follows US regulatory rules, and they use lots of arguments for cultural specificity and difference and all and hegemony to rationalize that, because it's incredibly difficult for them to leverage particular kinds of power in an environment that is even loosely relates to this, right? It's hard for them to leverage, crony capitalism if the world even vaguely concerns itself with corruption, right? So it's the level of influence. But I mean, I think this is right. I mean, if we want to do that, that's incredibly hard. It's not immediately clear to us whether we have other tools to do it, right? So I mean, is this actually fun? Like, is this actually a valid geoeconomic strategy? Because I mean, we've established you're not going to make them do what they don't want to do. The best thing you can do is create an environment that makes them difficult to fully leverage their power, right? We've established that maybe the point is to have conversations that that are more conducive to the way we see our environment than it is to actually get states to do so. Non-compliance, costs for non-compliance. And I mean, the end of the day is like, well, we need to try to put some pressure on China to behave this way. Is there a better way to do that? Like, is there actually a better way for us to influence China's market behaviors globally? And that's an open question. I mean, it's the kind of question that Baldwin would insist that you ask before you write something like this off.
I think the vehicles that I would think of, and they may not be accurate. Part of a document like this is they have to avoid completely showing their hand if they have a specific solution in mind for anything that they're discussing in the whole document. There's a reason the word security is in the document name, and it could be that there are underlying plans that aren't fully revealed here that are revealed
Well, I mean,
in
that's
other documents, but
that's every administration's argument, right? That, oh, don't worry, there's a secret working document, that a classified version. So there is a classified version of the NSS, there's a classified version of the NDS. But at the end of the day, I mean, as an analyst, I don't know if I take that very far, because I mean, credible deterrence requires clear, credible, and articulated threat, right? Like, you need to tell the adversary what you can do, what you're willing to do, and what will trigger it in order to deter them, right?
Well, I agree with that. I'm saying that I can see some real risks involved in revealing enough specifics that, okay, for instance, it goes into digital trade there. That's an easy thing for China to get on right away. And thwart if they revealed something that would relate to an actual plan for that. What we don't know in the document is there an actual plan? There's an intent, or there's a target that they think would be nice to aim at, but we do not know if there's an actual plan, nor do we know if there were alternatives considered of it, what the risks are, and what the drawbacks are to the barriers to it. But to a degree, I don't know that we could know in this particular document.
Well, no, we can't, but we can read this document and then we can, as analysts, look at the global environment and say, well, if this is true and this is the goal, then X, Y, and Z are likely outcomes or are the best possible approaches. And then we can go out in the world and look and see if the US is showing any evidence of doing that, right?
Yes.
So like we as analysts are not constrained by the document, right? And when you read public sector, like public source reporting on, that's what those people do every day, right? They read a document like this, they define the priorities, they say, well, if these are the priorities, these are the things that would have to happen in order to realize that. And then they can go out in the world and say, well, are we making those investments? Are we having these effects? Are we signing these agreements? And say yes or no, right? So we can still understand these and critique them without knowing that secret part, right?
I agree that we can take chunks of this particular passage in it, this section, maybe the whole thing, and I think that would be interesting to do. Analyze the potential, the ramifications, the vehicles they could use for that, and potential outcomes, and to some degree, the success of the outcomes. But as a document, the vagueness to me is just part of how they do it. The generalities that's what you're going to see in any of those.
All right.
Go ahead.
I think we have time to do one more, right? So,
One more?
Tasha, what's the next one on the list?
It's is success treated as a matter of degree? Beware of dichotomies and words like obvious, total, clear-cut, complete, or absolute failures. So yeah, is success treated as a matter of degree? So how are they defining success in these three paragraphs? Well, there's not a mention of those particular words. I was kind of reading a little bit. So saying in the second paragraph, I believe, where it says these efforts will create growth and innovation that benefits not only Americans, but people around the world. That seems like the measure of success, is that it doesn't just influence the American sphere, but it works for the entire global system, which is a stark difference in the past president's national security strategy. Where it was, we need to get the United States on a straight and clear path. We're not going to stay in any economic treaties that are disadvantageous to us for any reason whatsoever. So the diplomacy was cut out, where here the diplomacy kind of comes back in.
Yeah, and the imposition seems to be here that in that environment we wield more power or have resources, geoeconomic bases, right? In an environment where we don't.
Yeah. So that's how I feel like they did define the degree of success in this particular case, for this particular administration.
Yeah, you can start to see a logic here, right? So it's not just completely empty, right? Like there is an idea here that, and Marcy's right, there are other sections of the document that flesh this out a little bit more, right? There's also an entire section in here that talks about integrated deterrence, right? Which is a very real concept that is influencing other strategic concepts and is starting to shape how we organize the State Department and so on and so forth. But that's for another time. I mean, a world where our economy thrives is a world that it's open and exposed to other economies that will thrive as well. And in that environment, we wield more power than our adversaries, right? I think it's important to note that the stated national security strategy of the United States right now is premised on the idea of great power competition, not confrontation, and not transition, but competition. That we are going to have to compete for affluence, resources, and efficacy, right? And that means providing things. This is why in the first lecture I brought up the Nexon and I always forget. I know Dan, but I don't know the other author. So Cooley and Nexon book, where they make the argument about hegemonies really being predicated on the idea that they provide things to the system in order to create that kind of support. So I think you could see that through line a little bit. So I think Zartashi, you're right. There is at least some sense here in which success is understood, right? Which has ironically very little to do with actually getting China to do one thing or another.
Yeah, exactly. I was just looking back on something that I did on Biden's State of the Union a couple years back, and it was something where a couple of friends of mine had sent me questions, and so I just tried to answer them the best I could. And one theme that really stood out that's here in this NSS policy as well is this um, coming back to American manufacturing as a means of economic statecraft and leverage, which we had maybe lost over the past 20 years. And I was just looking back at what the question was, because Biden mentioned "Made in America" several times, and people are like, "This sounds very George H.W. Bush," and I'm like, "Well, it kind of is, you know." It seemed like a very, from a partisan point of view, it seemed like a very '90s Republican point that I see again in this trade and economics 3 paragraphs where talking about the economic leverage of mass producing consumer goods within the borders of the United States to as a strategic move to weaken Chinese economy.
Yeah.
Tasha, I agree with you. And the Made in America theme goes back to at least the 70s and before.
Yeah.
I remember, and being the senior citizen here, I remember that being a heavy duty theme, 60s and 70s at least, probably before that. But and it was a sin to a lot of people to buy a car from a Japanese car.
Right.
And that's just a simple example. And they slurred for a long time. Anything that said "made in China" was a joke. I don't know if you all know of that, but
Yeah.
it was considered, therefore it's cheap junk. And that's rather unfortunate. That country had to live with that label for a while. And it was unfair.
I mean, it's also not true anymore, right? Like China creates a lot of high tech, mostly consumer stuff, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's stuff they buy too.
It's also the point. I mean, even when Trump announced steel, I mean, Bush and Obama both tried tariffs of similar, and they both backfired and both took them back, right? Because they had serious negative effects on the U.S. economy, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things that, like, so, but I think what's interesting here, right, and this is where this becomes a genuine conversation, right, where we can start vetting like a sitting government stated national security strategy, right? By recognizing that what seems to be happening here, which is, I guess, where I would differ a little bit with Marcy, like, yeah, there's a lot of fluff in here. Yeah. But like, I actually do see at least an outline of something that looks like a strategy, right? And what's interesting about it is it has nothing to do with deterring China to do one thing or another, and it doesn't spell out, these specifics in many ways. Maybe that's a fault, right? We've established that that's probably a fault, right? But there is still in here the idea that this is genuine. It might be genuinely strategic, right? In the sense that it's talking about creating an environment that is conducive to our ability to leverage power, not an environment where we define everything that happens to every actor in each instance, right? Now, whether that's good or bad or not, I don't know. That's one of the reasons why I think reading the Baldwin section about where he talks about like, no, like even globalists and mercantilists actually share a lot of assumptions about the nature of geoeconomics, right? Like they're both. So this is one, right? This is an argument that says, well, I don't know if I can deter China from doing X, Y, or Z. I mean, Marcy said earlier, like, are you really going to prevent them from doing anything they're going to otherwise do? Probably not.
Not really.
Right?
The friend I have mentioned to you before has worked with China in terms of international law, not worked for them, but had to deal with them. I'm going to pick his brain about this.
But what? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Marcy.
This is not exactly what you were discussing here, but this is a question for you two. If the topic here is trade and economics has to, I would think, include risks to the economy or risk to economics in general. And they mentioned the digital dollar, and this was, I'm sure, crafted and probably published before the cryptocurrency scandal that happened recently. Should this section also include risks such as that are not that maybe that one specifically, but it is a specific thing that harm the economy? The attack on the World Trade Center, for example, was an attempt to bring down the economy.
Well,
and and I don't know that it should include that, but I'm kind of wondering why it doesn't mention.
well, no,
I think
think
it
that
does,
that's
doesn't
right.
it?
Because one of the things that's happening here, so now, Marcy, I think that's a natural follow-on to what I was saying, and I think we agree here, right? What I see here is an outline of a particular strategic approach, and if you start reading between the lines, I think you do start seeing an approach to. This would drive me insane. One of these days where everybody who comes in contact with me is annoying. Not you two. Not you two. There's a strategy here, right? There seems to be the idea that no, like we will be better served if we live in an environment that the discussion, the topic, and the approach is all shaped by those things up front. And we might not be able to get all states to comply, but we can create a world where there are costs to that non-compliance, and we can deny some of the geoeconomic levers to our competitors, right? So if we make it so that the world vaguely talks about kleptocracy and tries to at least attempt it, we will unearth enough Chinese kleptocracy that we can, right? Remember, it's all about gradations. It's not about absolutes. This is a world we're better off in. But I think you're right. That world creates particular risks to our
Right.
interests, to our domestic economy. And Baldwin is very clear that like you should assess those risks. But you need to understand what it is you're trying to leverage first before you'll be able to make heads or tails of them, right? So
Well,
I think, and he's agnostic. He's like, I'm not going to tell you X, Y, or Z policy is good or bad. That's not what I'm here to do, and then nothing about my book will tell you how to do that. He's like, that's for politicians to do. But what he is starting to say is, now we're starting to get into an environment where, like, well, yeah, some of this might pose risks to the U.S. economy, but are those risks outweighed by the fact that if we do nothing, like we won't have the same sort of geoeconomic leverage? And I think that's the point of conversation, right?
but and I'm not sure, maybe you're touching on that, but I think what I'm thinking of is the risk of digital dollar for cryptocurrency, for example, at all. It's a risky thing. What kind of security risk does that and any other type of well, a lot of the internet in general and the way countries are tapping into things from satellites now, those things didn't exist decades and decades ago. Some of them didn't exist 15 years ago. And I don't see, I would like to see a security, a document framed in security that includes the economic health of the country.
But that's what this document does, right? Because it stipulates that as a priority, right? So you're exactly right.
Well, all it says is a digital dollar to develop digital assets.
No, it said we will explore the merits and responsibility development of digital assets, including a digital dollar with high standards and protections for stability, privacy, and security to benefit a strong and inclusive U.S. financial system and reinforce its global primacy. A document like this would then signal something like the Treasury Department to go off and exercise that, right?
Okay, but
go off and do that thing.
Right. What he's framing it in is what this document frames it in is the vehicles and the places where the digital dollar goes, not the digital dollar itself. which is what happened with cryptocurrency. It went away. And whatever was there before that, billions of dollars were lost in the fakeness of it. And I see that as a question mark that maybe wouldn't have even been on the agenda for this document when it was crafted, because people just believed digital currency was going to be the way to go. And
Yeah,
I think
because it wasn't very well regulated. Sorry, I
Right.
didn't mean to cut you off.
or even defined. People
was-
were
Yeah.
mining bitcoins, and people
And
like me, what the heck are you doing?
I think this was in my other class that I took with Dr. McLennan with cyber warfare. About there's a different kind of deterrence when it comes to stuff like this, where you can't know every single move a bad actor is going to make, but what you can do is strengthen your defenses to the point where the hit is minimal, right? Cyber talks a lot about that. We can't anticipate every single action, every single problem. And I think Biden's administration does a good job of saying we can't anticipate every problem that's going to hit us. What we can do is build up our defenses, or in this sense, when we have non-compliant states like China, build a system where it becomes harder for them to do bad things. And I think
I agree.
the Blackwell
yeah.
and Harris books really touches on that. Make it harder to deflect. There needs to be some people that deflect, or some states that deflect, because then that's what establishes the kind of the norm between the right and the wrong, but make it difficult because you can't prevent every single action. We've seen that international relations is largely reactive. We can't predict everything that's going to happen.
Ransomware, for example, is an example of the action, and that's been widespread issue. The digital dollar is an issue all of itself.
Right.
It's one thing to pay a bill electronically, and it's another to have a form of currency that doesn't even exist other than digitally. And I think that's taking us into a really risky place.
Because it's not regulated or backed by anything tangible outside of that sphere.
Right. It's not
Outside
defined.
of that domain of cyber.
Right. It's not defined. It's not, the regulation thing is an excellent point. There are no trade parameters. There are no recognized transmission ways for it to happen compared to some other that they might be using.
Yeah.
And what else is out there besides Bitcoin or crypto? We don't even know what else they could come
Yeah,
up
there's
with.
a lot of forms of digital currency that, there's just so many, and it's so weird the way that I get lost in all of that is I just don't understand how it's backed when there's nothing.
Yeah, I don't even know what it is.
I mean, I know the US dollar has been off the gold standard for a very long time, but that's something I can wrap my head around. I have a hard time wrapping my head around digital currency because I just don't understand how
what I'm saying is
merit is put into it.
Yeah,
value
what
is
is the
put
next
into it.
thing that
Okay.
we could be hearing of? What is
All
the
right.
next thing beyond digital currency that could be out there? We don't know.
All right. So we're over time. Thank you both. I already stopped the recording. Yeah, and I get but I think that the discussion of global currency, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it poses a security threat in various kinds at various levels, right? But I mean, I think what the idea here is, it's a space in which we're going to have to compete, right? So like, we're going to have to figure out ways to do it better than someone else. And actually, I think all of the things that you just stipulated about cryptocurrency, because they are all speculative, they are all run through decentralized networks. They are not backed, right? They are not, no government backs them, no treasury manipulates their value, no assets stabilize them, right? So like, that's what sets them apart from a currency issued by a government, which Natasha pointed out, float, are not pegged to assets anymore, right? But I think what the document sort of, and now you can start to see some nested priorities, right? Where it starts to, well, this is a space we're going to have to, and we can do it better, right? Because at the end of the day, what it's not saying is, who would you so cryptocurrencies, if they're the future, right? if we're going to use them. Great. 3 options. Which would you like? Would you like a private sector company after the FTX fiasco? Would you like one that China backs with everything you know about their government? Or would you like one that's run by the US Treasury, right? Or like, which one would you like? And
None of the above.
the dice roll here is the one run by the US Treasury. I might not like it. I might like the states. You don't have to. Which one are you going to put your money in, right? Same as Treasury bills. I know a lot of people around the world who don't like the US government who probably own Treasury bills or buy into portfolios and hold them, right? Like, doesn't matter, right? We're not in this to make friends. So I think I think you can see that nested, like, no, we're going to create an environment that follows our regulatory standards and our expectations about workforce and so on. Flowery language, yes. But at the end of the day, it's saying, yeah, but if we even create an environment where there are costs to not doing that, right? It's an environment where we have authority and influence that we wouldn't otherwise have. So and then that means something like, well, yeah, cryptocurrency. Like, we should probably get into that business. Do we want to? I don't know. Maybe.
No.
But right, but if it's going to be an environment in which geoeconomics can happen, we can create an environment where it's at least conducive to some influence on our part, right? So while the document is deeply flawed in many ways, it is a strategy that we can put our hands on and talk about and critique, and it has some of the hallmarks of what Baldwin wants, and then a lot of missing a lot, right? But I think that's at least those. So thank you both very much.
And Baldwin, by the way, is probably still alive. I looked him up. He was born in, I didn't see anywhere that he died, and he was born in 1936. So he's probably ready to stop editing his books.
I don't know. Let's see.
I looked him up a little bit ago. That's why one of the reasons I was off target.
That's crazy if he's still alive. He's almost 100 then.
No, 36, 1936.
90.
Oh, yeah, so 90 something.
36 would be
Well, it's not
80.
Oh, is it 80?
Yeah, late 80s, I think.
My math skills are great.
Yeah, I think he does. No, this is David A. Baldwin. I don't know if that's him. Teaches at Columbia.
I found somebody. It went away.
I thought that Richard Haas would be like 90 after reading his book, and he was not 90.
He's just
he
grumpy.
sounds like a 90-year-old.
Yeah,
he's just grumpy.
He's just grumpy all the time.
Yeah, I've met him in real life, and that's what he's like.
That's crazy.
Who? Which one? Who? I didn't.
Richard Haas.
Oh yeah.
To be former president of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yeah.
Whose books I tend to use, not because they're the best, but because they're clear and are an argument that helps me. I assign him in the intro IR class. Although it's time to get rid of that book. It's a little dated now, but
I guess.
All right. Well, thank you both. Looking forward to developing this a little bit further. I think we are starting to get the rudiments here, right? We can start thinking about actual policies, and I think that's great. Any questions, let me know. Other than that, I hope you both have a wonderful evening. And I'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
All right. Have a good one, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.